The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Do you ever remember a company making a fundamental change to its product or its recipe that was a good one?
Now that's an interesting question because clearly it has happened multiple times, and you remember those that didn't go well. There probably are many that did go well, but you never hear of them. It only seems to be those that, for whatever reason, create controversy or get folks upset that you tend to hear about, right? I just happen to know, having a consumer products background, that formulas for products, even iconic products, right, that have existed for, decades, change far more regularly than people know without people really knowing or understanding that it's even happening. But those that were promoted as sort of new and improved, if you will, it's funny. I don't remember the good ones. I only remember the bad.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Robin Teets. He's a branding expert. You may remember him from episode 3, where we talked about Prince when he decided to change his name to a symbol. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Robin about the story behind the new Coke. That was the time that Coca-Cola decided to change its formula for what was then the world's most popular soft drink. In 1985, the Coca-Cola Company took the biggest risk in its history when it announced it was changing the formula for its flagship product. It branded its new formulation the New Coke. Consumer reaction was fast and furious. In 79 days, there was a firestorm of consumer reaction until the company decided to admit its mistake and return to the original formula that saw success over the previous 99 years. Robin, the last time we talked on the podcast, we focused on your interest in Prince and his music. But today, I think we're going to hit your marketing sweet spot, so to speak. We're going to talk about the Coca-Cola brand and more specifically, its decision to fundamentally change its iconic product. You have experience with iconic products. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the brands that you've handled?
I can, although first I need to thank you, because first you give me Prince as a topic, and now this time you give me New Coke as a topic. I clearly get the best topics. I don't know how your other guests feel, but I get the best topics. I do have a good deal of experience in dealing with iconic brands. Probably top of the list, the Heinz brand, Heinz ketchup specifically, but the Heinz brand broadly. Starkist and that iconic brand, Ore-Ida and that iconic brand, and even classic, business-to-business brands like Alcoa, for example, I have a fair amount of background in. I've touched and helped manage reputations for brands like FedEx, for example, and a lot of others. So I've had a pretty broad experience across the board in dealing with iconic brands. I've been kind of fortunate, I guess, in my career to have that experience.
When you work with an iconic brand, what's the kind of reaction that you get from your target market, your targeted audience? Do they have high expectations and you're always working to meet those expectations, or do you always sort of come up with surprises?
It's really interesting. A brand like Heinz and Heinz ketchup, it's not so much about meeting expectations as those expectations tend to be what are really the heart of the brand. The key sometimes, and I think this gets lost in a lot of brand management, is that we think as companies we own our brands. We own the Heinz ketchup brand. That brand very clearly is not owned by Heinz. That is owned by the people who have faith and belief in that brand. The job of a company is to, I guess, first not mess it up, and B, to perpetuate it. But in terms of, actively managing it and actively managing people's expectations, in some ways it's almost the opposite at times, like don't screw it up.
That's a good point, and that actually leads us to our topic today, and that is that The brand is not owned by the company. The brand is owned by the people who define it. And that's what we're going to talk about today with Coca-Cola, because their brand ran into some trouble on April 23rd, 1985. Coca-Cola announced that it would discontinue its beloved Coca-Cola formula for a new one. This marked the first formula change in that product in 99 years. At that time, the company said it was changing the formula for modern tastes. Coke and Pepsi, they were in the middle of fierce competition. This was when colas dominated the non-alcoholic beverage marketplace. The battle between Coke and Pepsi was dubbed the Cola Wars. The branding that made Pepsi so successful was its appeal to youth and building its marketing around a new generation. Pepsi was also sweeter and more sugary than Coke. We can speculate on what it was, but many experts have believed that Coke was inadvertently following Pepsi's lead when they tried to make the product more appealing to young people. Robin, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's clear, and I've heard the story retold from the Coke perspective and from the perspectives of folks that were involved in that effort as well. But all of that said, it's clear they were responding to the Pepsi challenge. Actually, no pun intended, because the Pepsi challenge was one of the key elements, right, that drove this in the mid '80s, which I suppose means that pun was intended. My apologies. But yeah, I remember very clearly the Cola Wars, right? In the early and mid '80s, and how intense that was. And Pepsi's positioning was really, it was the Pepsi generation, the choice of a new generation, right? Plus they had and promoted the Pepsi challenge, right? That they would consistently win blind taste tests. So there was a lot of pressure on Coke, and Coke's numbers at that time, and I don't recall the specifics of it, but they had been, even though they were still number one and still number one by a reasonable margin, they were eroding share for a decade or so. And I think there was a desire inside that organization, right, to do something that could change that dynamic, because it was also about the branding element. Pepsi, as you mentioned it, Pepsi was sort of hip, right? Michael Jackson was the spokesperson. Everybody still remembers his hair caught on fire when he filmed the commercial, right? And to this day, that's one of the big stories from that people remember pop culture-wise from the 1980s. But it was Michael Jackson, the new generation. Coke stood for something, yes, more iconic, but also something a little older. So it had a harder time sort of generating buzz, if you will, which is a classic problem with iconic brands. So all of that said, I think they absolutely were concerned about their eroding market share and were looking for a way to pick up some of those consumers that weren't theirs, or maybe were theirs and had crept away over time.
So they weren't worried about their base. They thought they would keep their core customers, do you think?
Oh, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that's probably where the core failing that we'll be talking about today came in, right? It is one thing to count on your base, but what they did is they actually changed something that was critical to the base, and they didn't really think about it in that context, because the market research told them that, yes, the targets they were going after, this is great, this is preferred, fantastic, the numbers look great. So, they moved forward, and, again, and we'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit about this, but it points out one of the problems with market research is that market research, by all accounts, was strong. If you looked at that research, you'd launch that product. There were other things beyond that particular market research that they didn't take into account, and that came back to haunt them temporarily anyway.
Right. As a matter of fact, even when you look at communications beyond marketing, one of the things that is a trap is when you accept the premise of your critic. So if you're a marketer, your critic is your competition. Pepsi, they had the Pepsi challenge. Pepsi was basing everything on taste. So what does Coke do? When they create new Coke, they make it sweeter. And you even had late night comics like David Letterman when this news came out, and there was backlash already. And David Letterman basically summed it up when he made a joke, and he said, Coke's decided to make their formula more sweet. They're going to mix it with Pepsi.
Right.
And that kind of summed up the whole marketing predicament in a nutshell. But one of the things that, when you look at that, and New Coke was sweeter than the original, but Coca-Cola described it differently. Coca-Cola said, as you said, that its share lead over Pepsi was slipping for over 15 years. The cola category, they said, was lethargic. They found that consumer preference for Coke was dipping, and so was awareness, at least by their standards, which was that of the leader. And they point back to this controversial decision as breathing life back into the category and the brand. What do you think about that? Do you think this whole controversy over changing the Coke recipe breathed life back into colas?
I think there are insights in that, in those comments that are correct. But no, I don't think it was a plan, and I think that's good spin at the end of the day.
Yeah, good spin. And plus, it was 20/20 hindsight. I don't know when they came up with that, but it wasn't at the time. But one of the things they did too, and you talk about research, Coke says they conducted taste tests with nearly 200,000 consumers, and I think this is where we talk about the mistake. They conducted taste tests, and they focused on taste, which is that premise that Pepsi wanted them to do, focus on taste. So they came back with what you said. They had test results. The test results were favorable. When there was a blind taste test and you had Coke drinkers drinking the original formula and the new formula, they preferred the new formula, without a doubt. As you said, there was no doubt they would launch this product if it was based solely on taste. What they didn't do in the research was take into account things beyond taste. What other things did they not take into account when they did this research?
Well, clearly again, I'd mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about who owns the brand. There are a set of expectations that true brand lovers have of that particular product. And there aren't a lot of categories, particularly anymore, where you have high levels of brand affinity. As I mentioned I worked on Heinz ketchup. Ketchup is actually one of those categories. Peanut butter is one of those categories. Cola, absolutely, and particularly in the 80s, was one of those categories. So if you, as you mentioned, right, they do the testing, they do blind testing, and that's critical in itself. Blind taste tests. And, they make new Coke a little bit sweeter by most accounts, right? And it wins taste tests. So that therefore means that product must be a superior product to the old product. But what they missed in a blind taste test is the value of the brand and people's perspectives on that brand and how they value that brand. And what's interesting in this case, at least to me, is that they more or less pulled the rug out directly from under those most loyal consumers by more or less, when they launched this, telling them this Coke is better. That Coke you loved was not as good as this Coke. That's a pretty poor premise on which to, on which to start a major change to your product. And again, blind taste test, sure, it probably would win back some of those Pepsi consumers, although that also doesn't take into account loyalty to the Pepsi brand and all of those expectations as well. So, I mean, it's a fascinating, I think, case study and important key learning for marketers, because I think market research is critical, and I've been involved in a lot of market research over the years, but it's not the only thing. And making sure you have perspective on the complete picture clearly is critical. Coke learned that the hard way. And then, of course, and I guess we can talk about this as well, they frankly brilliantly managed their own crisis to the point that they turned it around into a win.
They did. Eventually, they did come out on top, as you would expect and as we now know. But one of the things that we looked at when we talk about market research, in this case, taste isn't everything. When they tested the flavor, they never told participants that this flavor would replace the old recipe. Right. So people weren't necessarily thinking that they wouldn't have that choice that you mentioned, pulling the rug out from under themselves. Researchers focused on the physical. What factors, when you look at market research, if you were to go back and you were to do this research the right way, what categories of questions would you have added to this to enable a company not to miss the obvious?
So I don't know the details of how they managed the market research itself. But again, to your point, they tested taste blindly. And I do recognize that testing it from a brand standpoint would get them exactly what they already knew. So clearly you have to test it from from the standpoint of it being a blind test. But did you test the power of your brand? Did you test what it would mean to replace a product versus a line extension, right? Which they successfully did a couple of years later, right, with Cherry Coke, right, which was sweeter and it also had a cherry flavor, and that did wonders for lifting their overall market share, not just cannibalizing their core market share, right? So it can be done the right way. But again, it was almost as if they had blinders on. And I get this, having been inside the walls of corporations, you and I both have, when you're looking for a way out of what you perceive to be sales stagnation, and I suppose it was based on the numbers, right? You weren't falling through the floor, but it was stagnant. You look for things that can make an immediate impact. And when you come across market research like this, you say, holy smokes, go test that again. Go test that again. They tested it with, what did you say, a couple 100,000 consumers, right, by the end of the day. And we get the same results. This is it. We've got to go for it. That excitement, I think, sometimes can permeate an organization and sort of prevent you, I guess, from maybe seeing the bigger picture, because what you're seeing is a way out of the stagnation. So you roll with it. And they rolled with it. And it rolled back downhill on them a little bit, didn't it?
They spent $4 million on development of this product, and all of that, not all of it, but most of it was research. So they really were committed to research. This wasn't a flippant decision. Of course, we now know there were protests. Shortly after the announcement, there was a groundswell. This erupted among consumers, but consumers weren't the only ones. Consumers sent letters to the company. They called the company, and that was just the beginning. The company was actually getting 1,500 calls a day on a company hotline, which I guess we're to assume by those days' standards, that was a lot. Overall, they received about 400,000 angry calls and letters. People started to hoard cases of Coke. They actually started buying more of the original Coke that they could find. And then the protest started. And this is where we talk about people. The consumers who sort of reacted independently were one thing. Then we had one man. His name was Gay Mullins, and he was of Seattle, and he launched a lawsuit. So he was more than just a disgruntled consumer. He formed a group that was called Old Cola Drinkers of America. He said that he received 60,000 calls a day in support of his effort. I don't know if that's true or not, but he said he did. He staged media events. He created a logo of his own that included the new Coke logo crossed out, one of those ones with the circle and the red cross through it. And he had these logo pins. But the message was unanimous, whether it was from Gay Mullins or from the other people who were affected by this. People wanted the old Coke back. So what would you do? I mean, have you ever experienced a brand crisis where people had a problem with a change made to a brand?
I mean, certainly nothing like new Coke versus old Coke, because I don't know that we've seen such a thing since then. Probably because of all the key lessons learned. You know, one of the things, as you're citing those stats, right, and the protests and such, that makes me wonder: could you imagine if Coke in 2018 would do such a thing? What the protests would be like with social media, and how much more coverage that could get almost instantly. And in fact, it doesn't even really need media coverage. It takes on a life of its own. Though the media coverage, I think, helped perpetuate Coke's problem back in 1985, because that was an interesting story. What's a more interesting story? Coke changed its formula, or there are people that want the old formula back. So those numbers that you share sound impressive in the overall scheme of cola drinkers. They're minuscule, but it was a good story.
It's a classic case study of mistakes that people have made. But you mentioned the social media.
Yeah.
It's impossible actually now to even look at that without thinking of the social media, because people would be tweeting, taking pictures. They would be on everything from Instagram to Snapchat, all over the place. And that always feeds the regular media, and it goes in a cycle. And it would be much bigger than it is today. That's why it's almost funny or quaint when we look at those numbers and we see 1,500 calls, because you would get 1,500 tweets in a minute.
Well, but I will say this, having, in my role with Heinz North America for years, if we got 1,500 calls in one day about anything, it would freak us out, because that's not typical. Consumer resource lines, consumer complaint lines just don't get that kind of volume. So the numbers do sound small, and I just said, in the overall scheme of things they are, but that's a pretty big number for a company to get out of the blue, most definitely.
Companies pay attention to that, don't they? How do they typically respond when they start seeing that?
Well, it depends on the numbers. If you get 10 or 15, you explore it a little bit. You might even reach back out to those individuals and give them specific information. Certainly, we've done that in the past, during my time at Heinz. If you had 1,500, you'd be calling crisis meetings inside the marketing department with senior leadership as well, not just the marketing department. And I'm sure that's what happened with Coke.
Well, there was corrective action. Coca-Cola did get that message, and it didn't take too long, 79 days. So by July of 1985, the company decided to bring back the original Coke. And they did it gradually. This is where you were talking about earlier, how they managed themselves out of their own crisis. They reintroduced the original Coke, and they called it Coca-Cola Classic. But they continued to offer new Coke under a different name. Coke 2 actually was one of them. Finally, the company stopped making that alternative 17 years later in 2002. But in the meantime, Coca-Cola Classic was the drink. It came back to satisfy those people who were disgruntled. Once Coca-Cola Classic was reintroduced, sales actually went up over time, and brand loyalty for a large number of base consumers was strengthened. How would you describe what Coke did right about managing themselves out of this?
Well, the first thing, and it was important, and I actually remember, seeing it on TV, was the mea culpa itself. I can't remember who it was, whoever was the head of Coke at the time, who went on TV and basically said, we recognize more or less that many of our consumers miss the old Coke, so we're going to bring back Coca-Cola Classic. So basically the best of both worlds. Mea culpa first. I think the acknowledgement, that is what. You think about it, I talked about earlier, they sort of pulled the rug out from under their hardcore fans, and then they heard their hardcore fans, and they gave them back what they wanted. I think that actually, in a strange way, over the course of time, actually enhanced their brand value and that brand affinity. And I'm not surprised that the numbers went up. And this is where, and I said earlier that it's spin, that as if it were planned all along. That was, of course, spin. But there are real insights in that spin that are correct. This did turn out, I believe, to be a good thing for Coke, particularly, again, I go back to what I said earlier, it's hard for an iconic brand, the number one, the one that can't get the buzz, to get the buzz. Maybe it's not the way they intended, but they ended up finding a way to get the buzz at the end of the day. And it helped lift their business.
It did. In fact, we have some numbers. In the long run, it did kind of help the brand. 75% of those surveyed said they'd buy new Coke again. This is the research they did afterwards. So people did like new Coke. New Coke sales were actually on a par with original Coke sales from a sales standpoint, not from a publicity standpoint. Right. The main thing was people did not like the idea of not having the option of both old Coke and new Coke, or classic Coke and new Coke. And the switch did not help Pepsi. A lot of people like to assume, this is probably one of the big myths, and you brought it up right at the outset. The switch did not help Pepsi. Pepsi saw worse sales in 1985 when this all happened than it had in 1984 before all of this happened. So Pepsi actually was hurt by this. New Coke actually outperformed Pepsi. So from a business standpoint, it did that. But Coca-Cola also introduced Cherry Coke, as you mentioned, a little bit later, and that seemed to do as much for the Coke brand as anything because it was sweeter, and it did start to target the same people who might be drinking Pepsi. So it was Cherry Coke and not New Coke that seemed to do what Coke wanted to do all along. But that's a line extension, and I know you have a lot of experience with line extensions. Tell me a little bit about the theory behind line extensions and why they're so important.
Well, and I think the Cherry Coke example probably gets to the heart of it. What you're trying to do with a line extension is to expand your market share without cannibalizing your base business. So really you're looking for an extension that will either bring in new consumers, those that aren't consuming your base brand, and or will consume more because perhaps they will buy both. Now, that's usually a smaller number, but that's more or less what you're trying to do. If Coke would have done that initially and said, that there is new Coke and Coke Classic, it's fascinating to think about. Would the numbers have played out the same way, or would that have just been an interesting line extension? Or did they actually benefit more ultimately from their mistake It's one of those things, right, that we'll never know. But really interesting. But New Coke could have just as easily been a line extension, and it could have been very popular. In fact, one could argue that Cherry Coke more or less was probably mirrored what would have happened if you would have put New Coke out in the marketplace as a line extension. But not all line extensions work, of course, because sometimes people don't want to see that particular flavor in this instance, or sometimes it just cannibalizes your base business. So where it looks like it works from a sales standpoint on the new product, the vast majority of your consumers were already your consumers. That's what you try to avoid. And that's a tricky thing, to be able to launch a product like Coke did successfully, right, with Cherry Coke. This entire topic is fascinating to me from a brand standpoint. And, there were casualties along the way. You think of Bill Cosby, for example. And I went back, actually, all these commercials, by the way, are still on YouTube, which is really cool. But I remember that very first commercial, the excited Bill Cosby, the incredible has happened. This is the best tasting Coke in the history of ever, right? 1985. And then a series of others after that. It came back actually to haunt Bill Cosby a little bit, who, let us not forget, despite what we know about Bill Cosby now, Bill Cosby was perhaps one of the most trusted figures in America in the mid-'80s. He was Cliff Huxtable. You think of him as the Jell-O pudding pitchman, right? So a brilliant choice for Coke. He actually worked for Coke before this, and therein lies the problem. There was an ad about a year before that more or less was pointing out that Coke was superior to Pepsi because Pepsi added so much sugar because it was so sweet. And then a year later, we have Bill Cosby, the pitchman, contradicting himself and giving the level of trust that he had with America. He ultimately resigned as pitchman because he had lost some level of credibility. And he was never, frankly, used as a pitchman as much after that, probably for that reason. So that's one of those little pieces that people don't talk about, but that I find fascinating.
And why?
Because we think, so now I think we're awfully jaded about somebody trying to sell us something. But this is a guy that legitimately had credibility. We would listen to him. He was a good pitchman. He was their response to Michael Jackson, and, Pepsi's always done a great job from a celebrity culture standpoint. You get into the 90s and the iconic Cindy Crawford standing at the vending machine ad. Brilliantly done, the Pepsi generation stuff. He was their response, ultra credible. And they put him in a position that he compromised his credibility and could no longer be effective for them.
What's the bottom line lesson for any consumer brand from this?
I think there are probably several. Well, first off, props for the effective crisis communications management, right? But I think in terms of key lessons, the biggest thing is that market research is critically important, but it doesn't tell you everything. That you need to not have tunnel vision when making such a big decision as to fundamentally change your brand, particularly when it's an iconic brand. Because I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. Coke thought they owned their brand. They found out they didn't own their brand. The brand was owned by the folks that consumed their product, and it was underpinned by all of their expectations of what Coke is and should be and shouldn't be. And you can always, within the realm of can be, you can make changes. But at some point, there are certain changes that can't be made because it's not true to your brand in the eyes of consumers. I think that's a key lesson. I think Coke took it even one step further and more or less pulled the best part of their brand. They sort of yanked out from under. I said earlier they yanked things out from under their most loyal customers. They kind of yanked their own brand out from under themselves. But then they found a brilliant way to actually manage it as well, and it ultimately ended up helping them. But I think that's really the key lesson, is that branding is complicated, number one. Number two, we only think as companies, right, that we own our brands. We don't really take into account the full scope of opinion of our customers and or prospective customers, and that's really critical. I think when you're trying to make changes like Coke tried to make with their brand, which I'm not sure we'll actually see again outside of a true crisis circumstance. If Coke were down to 20 share, it's time to try anything. But to see a market leader fundamentally change its product, I'd be stunned if we see it again.
Robin Teets, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much again for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Robin Teets, and you'll find links to the whole story behind the new Coke fiasco. You can also listen to other episodes, and don't miss the next episode. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find on your favorite podcast channel and at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.